retargeting to www, and we have JDD 1, finally, which had this incredible slogan that you write it once, you run it anywhere, which led many people, upon witnessing what you need to do to actually have it, to ask, so I'm doing all that to run C code actually, which if you think about Scala is something that a number of people addressed to Scala lately. Of course, everything was in network byte order, and interestingly enough, Windows was the only machine then which actually had just-in-time compiler, because otherwise the compilation was just too slow. So they had first GC, unless we count Lisp, which had it like 40 years earlier. They had first VM, unless you count Smalltalk, which had it like 10 years earlier. And they actually did the green threads, which were user space threads, which was very interesting because Java was the first language which actually was shipped with multi-threading support built in. You had language, you didn't need any libraries to do multi-threaded code, which was fairly awesome. But of course, since memory consistency model was hard to get right for the first time, they didn't get it right. It took Tiger to actually fix it. Then they had Sandbox, because if you want to have Java run in a browser, you also want to actually have Sandbox to prevent somebody from actually touching your files, taking them from you, or using your machine for pretty much everything that that person wants. So, interestingly, also they had reflection, and also they had inner classes even back then. Now, December 8, 1998, we actually start growing. We start growing with Playground, which is, interestingly enough, tripled in size. This is also where Collection made their first appearance. This is also where Permgen made their first appearance. Now, we had Swing, we had JVM, pretty much each JVM now, be it Windows or Linux or pretty much any architecture. It also came with a built-in JIT compiler. Interestingly enough, then Sun Marketing decided that it's time and it's the era of the enterprise. So for the next few years, if you worked on a desktop project at Sun, you could pretty much forget about getting any marketing or funding or pretty much any interests, which also caused JavaFX to appear much later than it did. And that's actually a shame, because JavaFX was a very nice technology, still is. Also because EJB was a trademark, then Richard Oberg, who created Enterprise Java Beans open source server, got from Sun legal department a cease and desist letter, and then he had to finally come up with, well, let's name it JBoss. So we had J2E era. We actually had Standard Edition, Mobile Edition, and Enterprise Edition. And this is where things diverged. This diversion was actually hurting till Tiger much, much later. But first, we had the growth. From 2000, we had Kestrel, which is this one, and we had Merlin, which is this one. Lots of APIs. Also, one important distinction. NIO, non-blocking I/O, or some people call it new I/O, it's really old right now. If you do not know it, if you do not use it, please, after this presentation, go away to some quiet corner and pick up a few things, because this is actually very useful I/O. Now, first community edition, as of which introduced Java community process, which actually made Java sort of open source language if you're big enough and you adopted enough JSRs to actually be on the committee. And then we had the fourth life, 2004, which is Tiger. Still very relevant, introducing a lot of changes, like, for example, generics. Tiger also was the very first signal that if you plan to do a really, really large release, you need to prepare well in advance. For example, just generics, they were like in the making for at least 3 years. So, enum annotation, forargs, varargs, auto and unboxing, concurrency, scanner, improved Java memory consistency model. Finally, keywords like final, volatile, and synchronized, they worked correctly as they were supposed to be working. Then we had the unlife till 2012, where we had the Mustang and the Dolphin, which didn't introduce a lot of good, but, well, some of it. And most notably, it was for the Dolphin that we tried, well, Oracle tried, then Sun tried, sorry. Sun tried to actually get the Dolphin to include things for 8 and for 9. So lambdas, they were supposed to appear in Java 7. Jigsaw, it was supposed to appear in Java 7. So even then, they were working on things which they released right now. So Project Coin was pretty much the only thing that made it to the language and which has like minuscule changes. Like the most important change in JDK 7 is try with resources. Now, interestingly enough, they opened with adding the invoke dynamic, they opened the JDK itself and JVM for the dynamically typed languages. And invoke dynamic right now in Java 9 is used to indify string concatenation. So right now, string concatenation will be using invoke dynamic. Thanks to it, the bytecode for the string concatenation will be shorter, and in future, we'll be able to optimize it even more without changing. So we took a break from the sun when Oracle took it over, and Oracle decided that they need to actually have some sort of release process, and they started with it. Now, interesting enough, in the release process or release notes, you not always hear about the game changers, like why they are doing what they are doing. So they are doing this because with invoke dynamic, you got a lot of languages. Each UFO here is one language on the JVM. Okay? And this is like 3 or 4 year old t-shirt. Now, the other game changers are obviously big data, Internet of Things, and the cloud. They all mean that you can't do things as you used to do them. If you used to have actually monolithic application, now it will not be as good. You used to actually worry not about the resources. With Internet of Things, where resources are scarce on a device, you need to worry about them. So, number of changes which led to us needing something else than the kingdom of nouns. Java is famously compared to a kingdom of nouns because you can't actually talk about activities. You have to talk about objects. So it's not I parsed XML file, it's my XML parser parsed XML file. It's not I opened the file, my file opener opened the file. It's not I created an object, my object factory created an object. So, current life. March 2014, JDK 8, September 21, 2017, JDK 9. These changes are actually large changes. FYI, because with the time allotted I will not be able to cover things deeply, I've created a simple presentation which tells you about all the content for the JDK 9 on JDD. So there is a number of other presentations, and I actually encourage you to go here, take a look, because if you're interested in this, there are other people who are covering things much deeper, but singular things. So, JDK 9 actually had 91 reps. Interesting, first things that I want to bring to your attention is G-Shell. G-Shell is Project Kula. Project Kula is named after a Mesopotamian deity which actually created things and then it was banished. So when the job was done, the deity was banished. And this is actually a hint. When you're done with the REPL, banish the REPL, open the IDE, and just import what you've created. Now, you have good documentation. To avoid doing the random string when you try to exit, here is the exit command. Pretty much whenever you want to use the command, it's / command, like exit, help intro, help shortcuts. Among the shortcuts, you have tab key, which allows you to quickly bring up the completion or actually save things as a variable. Or actually, there is one more option with the tab, but I don't recall it at the moment, but help shortcuts will tell you what it is. List. It brings up everything that you've did in a REPL. Save allows you to create a Java file out of it. So with this, you're actually able to have Java act as a scripting language. You can create a class, you can have the class do something, you can save the result of this operation, and you can bring it easily through G-Shell using open some Java file. I encourage you to use actually the illegal notation so that you would not think that it is actually the normal Java file with the classes inside. If you have a problem, which is that your tab completion doesn't work, usually this is caused by the fact that shell uses gline, gline uses readline, readline follows the input RC. If your input RC is, for example, crafted for other programs than the G-Shell, then you will have messages like unable to bind key for unsupported operation or invalid preferences format in name of the file. Just go, make the necessary changes in your input RC, and you will be able to use the G-Shell. Now, more about the REPL, including building a web app with it, will be shown by Kuba Marchwicki. So 11:30 tomorrow, track 1. Project Jigsaw, another great change, and this is pretty much the theme of the JDK 9. So the rationality behind it is pretty much jar hell and the class path and the monoliths. These three things. So pretty much the game changers are easily seen here. So what is it about the jar hell? Well, it's pretty much you having different versions of the jar hell or having different classes in your jars, which are named in this very same manner, which leads to your class loaders picking either the necessary files or the mix of the files or all the wrong files, which you will never know about unless you're very rigorously logging every class that you're loading and you're checking for what you're loading. Of course, the tools like Maven, they give you the exclusions, and you can use exclusions to actually escape some of the problems with the jar hell. But another problem comes that the class path is fairly large for large systems. It can actually span like several jar files, it can span even 100 and something jar files. Each jar files will be added because it will be memory mapped, so you'll have to actually use memory for this, and you will actually have to use the CPU operations to actually scan it. So, not that great. Now, finally, using Mark Reinhold's words, jars are not components, they are just files. Not to mention that the format itself is pretty much a glorified zip. So performance not that much. So adding to it that JDK itself weighs a lot. If you wish to have cloud, you wish to have automation. If you wish to have automation, you need to actually create and install all the necessary systems on your servers. So I need to download the JDK and unpack it and install it, and this takes time and bandwidth. If I have 100 servers and I need to download it 100 times, not really that great. With Jigsaw, you're able to actually cut the JDK from almost 800 megabytes down to almost 30 megabytes. There is already a Docker image with just 30 megabytes and the entire JDK, which is used for most of the things. So your Java application which uses JDK will also wait a lot. Oh, come on. Pretty please. Mr. Maciej is asked to report and provide the password. This will take a moment. So while we actually think about shooting straight here, and as you can see, my hands are shaking, so I will not make the shot. So if anybody wants to bet, I will probably lose. Going on with the modularity. JDK introduces modularity to solve two problems, the jar hell and the class path problem. The other thing that they aim at is to provide you a way to not create monolithic application and to not rely on a monolithic JDK. Obviously, this is not something that can happen like so. So it is a great pleasure when you watch Chief Architect of Java talking about the technical depth and actually, having this really discomfortable expression at his face. So Google any video of Mark Reinhold introducing modules when he actually talks about what is necessary if you wish to create a simple Hello World application. Because you see, he has to admit that they need RMI, Corba, and JAXP for system out Hello World. So very interesting, and this is what happens when you're developing for like 20 years and you accumulate a lot of technical debt. So there is hopefully a number, there are few good indicators that show that there is some promise in the future. So microservices, which pretty much now everybody wants to do or already are doing, aren't monolithic, and they shouldn't be monolithic. And we have the game changers, the cloud, the limited resources of the Internet of Things, and the big data, which requires us to work functionally. So, Rabea already shown with number of problems from the, pretty much same sort of problems that I have. How to refactor your code to JDK modules. I encourage you to actually take a look at her video because it was pretty nice. If you didn't have the opportunity, there is a very good introduction to modules from the Jigsaw JABS itself, which allows you to create a simple Hello World module and actually tells you what you can have there. Now, interestingly enough, oh hell, I will not, do I have the internet here on this machine? We shall try. Okay, in just a moment. So Project Jigsaw jobs are. First one was to prepare for modularization. This actually dealt with class path issues in the internal JDK APIs. So right now, instead of class loader, we are actually using service loaders. What are services? Just a moment. Then we try to modularize JDK. Then we actually went for the source code. So this is the Jigsaw itself. And this is what is aimed at the cloud. So standard class libraries are now modularized. There is no rt.jar. There are actually modules instead. You have base module, you have SE modules. And these modules are quite a tight graph right now. Most of internal APIs are now encapsulated. This is wrong, this shouldn't be here, but var handles and unsafe is part of the efforts that are actually about the encapsulation. So base 64 encoder from old Sun packages and also SunMISC unsafe are like two top libraries used throughout the open source and not only open source from the internal packages. Now the problem with this is that these APIs are meant to go away. So if you happen to spot these in your code, do change them. Now for the unsafe, since there are a lot of libraries which require unsafe, and since there are pretty much no alternatives to some of the unsafe operations elsewhere, then unsafe stays for now. But there is already a white box project which is meant as a replacement, and var handles are part of those. Of course, we need also tools. So Java Packager will allow you to package your module, and it will be it creates better formats, and you have also Java Linker to connect your modules inside. In a nutshell, you always use a base module. Every single thing uses base module. Now then, you're specifying in your module what you're requiring, what you're exporting, and what you're using. Require, which is modules you need. Export, what you're publishing. Here is where public changed in its scope, actually. And then what you're using, which is required services, which will be loaded via service loader. So this all is actually described in a module info Java, which uses a module path instead of the so far used class path. JLink and JDepend are very nice tools which you will be using, and you have also the dependency visualizer for the Jigsaw. So if you happen to want to know what is using what in a form of a graph, you already have the tool. Now the module summary is a very good way to familiarize yourself with pretty much all the base modules that you're using. And let's see if I have the internet. Tam 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 ta da dam. If you ever seen Jaws, that was attempt at it. Oh, come on. And here. It's command here, right? What does it say? Yes, allow it. Enter. Yeah. Okay. Coming back to the presso. Default GC is G1. Default GC G1, which is actually interesting enough that it is meant as a replacement for CMS. So the previous combination with CMS being for the old and par new being for the young, this is deprecated right now. You can use it, but be aware that in the future this will go. Which is a bit of a shame, because from my own experiences, G1 is good, but there are cases where CMS is better, especially when you have smaller heaps. Like, think of heaps under 6 gigabytes, and the G1 is not the perfect algo for these. Nevertheless, G1 regionalizes the heap. So you're having around 2,000 regions in the heap, which are divided into 3 regions, which can be assigned into some other regions later. Then you have the tenured regions, you have the Eden, which pretty much is where the allocation happens with one exception. Then you have the survivor, and you have the humongous regions. Now, humongous regions, as you can see, they are like 2 or 3 normal regions gathered together. Interestingly enough, in the humongous regions, you can also allocate, despite them being part of the old generation. So this is still generational garbage collector algorithm, but it changes number of ways. For example, I can evacuate or garbage collect this Eden region and this survivor region as a mixed collection. Or I can actually do this and this old regions because it actually happens that they are full or close to full. So with G1, we have number of improvements, and the concurrency is high enough to name it a CMS successor. Also, you deal with the problem of promotion failure because you have the huge objects with dedicated regions. So there will no longer be the case where you have a huge object which is like half of a region large or greater, because right now you're having a region for it. Interestingly enough, huge objects may cause the fragmentation of the heap, because how many huge objects do you think I can allocate here? Let's say that the object is like 1/2 of a region large. One object. Well, one object for this and one object for that, and that is all. Okay? So no matter how much of a region I'm taking the full region. So the remaining space is used, or actually it's wasted. Which sometimes may lead to so-called evacuation failure, which is the largest failing of this algorithm. Nevertheless, there are interesting information which I need to share about it. First of all, even in JDK 8, we had string deduplication, which means that G1GC actually has a pinned regions for strings. Every single string which we find in all the regions, which is a duplicate of a string found elsewhere, will be deleted and moved to this pin region and hold there. So you're in no risk that you're having duplicated strings if you run G1. Any other algorithm will not have this feature. Another thing is that you may actually hold your strings in classes data sharing archives. So this also is working only for the G1GC. Nevertheless, it saves you space even more. And the deprecated combinations from the 8 of the algorithm for the GCs were removed. Now, we had 9 JEPs which deal with Javadocs, Nashorn, and Unicode. Among the Javadocs, we can finally use HTML5 there. We can have the search box in our Javadocs, which will allow people to search for methods or for pretty much any strings as they want. Well, I don't expect much out of it because I already used the Control F from my web browser, but still, it's an option. We're having property files which will finally be coded in UTF. So forget the decoding from ISO into UTF so that you can have regional properties. You can now have the properties directly in the files. Also, Unicode 7 introduced 2,800 characters, and Unicode 8 introduced 7,000 characters, and we now have them supported in our Java classes, or Java properties, or whatever else. Nashorn has now API for the parser, so you can parse the script programmatically. You can also actually have ECMAScript 6 features if you write JavaScript for the JVM. And more concurrent updates, which is yet another very good thing. There is this so-called reactive streams movement, which allows us to write application which react to events much faster, much better, and using streams. This is simplification, so bear with me if you know more. Now, interestingly enough, in Java 9, we have a native support for this. I say interestingly because usually when you want to do something like it, you need to actually gather everybody in the industry and make them agree on this. And this time it happened that everybody in the industry agreed on this, and then they went to Oracle and they were like, hey, we agreed, why don't you introduce it? So this is not actually, this is a change which didn't went through JCP. It wasn't actually sponsored by somebody from the committee. It was actually pushed for by the industry, and everybody agreed. So really good API. I recommend you because Piotr decided to sacrifice entire 40 minutes for it, just for the flow. And you will be able to see how flow in Java 9 is different from Eric's Java or Reactor from the Spring framework. So recommend it. Now things will be removed, which is a bit shocking when I learned for the first time, but once I started reading about what they are removing, I was like, okay, well, I can live with it. So demos and samples, which are not really the greatest code around because they were created like several years ago. The HubProf agent for the tool interface will be removed because it was actually created more as a demonstration of what the tool interface is capable of, not as an actual working and production-ready example. GC combinations I already mentioned. Interestingly enough, Applet API will be just deprecate, but with the enhanced deprecation, deprecate annotation now can have the variables inside it, and for removal, field will be set to false, which is a bit funny because if you take a look at all the major browsers saying very, very clearly that they are not supporting outlets, they are shutting out Java in the browser and all that, you would think that you could remove Applet API. Well, apparently not yet. There are applet viewers which are used in the industry, so this will stay for some moment longer. Finally, we're having security. Security changes are interesting because they're actually bringing us up to the current industry standards. Well, most of it. So when you're using OTSP, it will now have less traffic going on because the unnecessary traffic will be eliminated. You will be able to use SHA-free hash algorithms, and if you have a certificate with SEHA1, it will no longer be honored because it's unsafe. It shouldn't be honored for like several years now, but okay. If you're using serialization, you will be able to actually filter incoming data, which is like the first security mechanism in serialization ever. And you can actually create PKCS12 keystores by default without actually having to go into configuration. JDK9 also allows you to have unlimited cryptography in a simpler manner, and in the future, it's meant to be pretty much built in. I don't know if this is clear, but right now, if you wish to have a full cryptography, you need to go to obscure Oracle website, download the package, and agree to a license, meaning you will never harm the United States. Now, selected things from the library sites. If you're into XML parsing, you will most likely want to know that selected Xerxes updates were pulled into JDK9. We have stack walking API. Most internal APIs are encapsulated, meaning it will be much harder to get to them and use them. This is, let me stop here for just a moment, because there was a huge debate about which is going on, which is being hidden, which is not being hidden, and let me tell you that the SunMISC unsafe is not yet disappearing. They're planning to actually make it go away, but these are plans. More concurrent updates, aka flow, but also completable future and number of small API changes. Convenience factory methods for collections, which is absolutely awesome. Unless you're using Guava, then you will be like, okay, I have it already. But convenience factory methods for collections are actually about you no longer creating, for example, array list and then first element, adding second element, adding third element. Now you're having a builder or a factory method named off, so you'll be able to create the array list of and 3 elements as parameters. If you've ever used enumset, enumset already has this method, so this is pretty much the same API. It will use the vararg. Now, the JVM changes. Let's see what is yet missing. So, for example, we have 2 new ports. We have port for Linux Arc, and we have one more which I've misplaced in the slide, but I'll find it later. we are unifying the logging, which is pretty big deal. So if you ever were on the side of performance and you were trying to find out whether you have a class loading issue, whether it's a compilation issue, whether it's GC or you not reaching save points soon enough or whatever else, you actually had to parse different logs from different JDK subsystems and JVM subsystems. So those subsystems were outputting the information in pretty much their own manner. So you had the logging from various sources, and it was actually quite different and not very easy to follow. So right now, these JEPs are aimed at actually make this logging look in a same uniform fashion. So you will have the information about which subsystem is actually outputting the data. You will have the ability to format this output. You will have the ability to actually configure JDK to output it more to your liking. With compiler control, you will actually have the ability to tell the compiler how you want it to work, much greater than before. It's not just client and server, it's actually a number of other things. You will have the enhanced method handles, that is, in using reflection API, you will be able to actually pick up try and catch blocks or loops, and you will be able to browse through loop clauses using the reflection API. Reserved stack areas for critical sections. So if you take a look at how stack is currently organized, there is nothing that makes it easy to locate a critical section. Right now we will have reserved stack areas so that the synchronization will be able to speed up. We will have also the compiler interface from which we will be able to use programmatically. Since Cassandra people spotted a number of problems with humongous objects allocation, and since the evacuation failure in G1 is actually a rather big thing, we actually went and created, well, I'm talking we, but I actually mean the Oracle and JDK teams, sorry about that. So the guys actually went and created a number of tests strictly for the humongous objects cases, which are now built into JDK builds. G1 as the default garbage collector already mentioned. Platform-specific desktop features. This is a feature which will be interesting for those of us who are in the process of creating a desktop application, so-called window applications. So right now, you will be able to have the features like rounded corners, rounded buttons, and other things which so far only your operating system was able to render. Right now, the graphics in the Java will also be able to render this. In-defined string concatenation is something I already mentioned. We'll be using invoke dynamic instead of intrinsics in the bytecode. So we will be able to later change the invoke dynamic with function call. So once we optimize the function, we'll optimize the string concatenation without having to actually change it. The invocation will stay the same. Annotations pipeline is about moving the APT tools capabilities into the compiler themselves. New version string is something I'm glad to see, because right now, when you look at Java versions, you may think like, oh, this is update 33, and I'm here having update 40, so obviously update 40 is, newer and richer in functionality. Actually, the problem is that every update which is the multiple of 20, so update 20, 40, 60, 80, and so on, is about security patches. So different beast entirely. Now, this version string, I'm very curious how it will survive the newest announcement from Mark Reinhold, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. You will be able to specify the release flag for the JVM, for the Javas actually, and instead of compiling with source and target, which not necessarily gets you the result you usually want when you use it, you will be able to get the result you want with the release flag. So you will have the capability of actually compiling to the older language with your new compilation. This is very important because it allows you, it makes the JDK 9 something that allows you to get rid of, for example, JDK 6 or 5 if you had them just to compile the old code. You will now be able to do this with JDK 9. Now to go in the other direction, we have multi-release jar files, which are fairly interesting. Namely, the difference is in the manifest, you're having one additional flag, multi-release set to true. When this flag is set to true, you're actually making this jar a double-sourced jar. That is, I'm having sources for JDK 8, and I'm having sources for JDK 9. If it's JDK 9 that picks up this jar, it starts loading the JDK 9 sources. If it's JDK 8 that picks up this jar, it starts loading the 8 sources. In the future, if it will be JDK 10, it will also behave the same way. So your jars and releases will be able to be handled by multiple JVMs, which is fairly nice idea. More diagnostic commands allows you to use jcommand utility to actually talk with JVM and make it output more data. Among the diagnostic commands are, if I recall correctly, static action native memory was earlier. There are a couple of goodies here, but out of my memory right now, I'm unable to recall. Validate JVM command line flag arguments is something that I wanted JVM to include since like version 6. This was the first time when I had actually an assignment about performance. I was forced to use various flags. I misplaced the arguments in those flags and was wondering why the hell am I not getting the result I want. I wasn't, because actually my command line parsed the flags properly. So right now, in the case like this, you will be getting the information. Variable handles, part of actually replacing the sunMISC unsafe. This JEP is about giving you the operations, atomic operations, safe, consistent, and leaving the memory with great integrity, which allow you to actually update the arrays or primitives. Finally, more tests and class file attributes for Javadoc will now have automatically generated class. If you ever had the problem in import statement that you used a deprecated API and your import had a deprecation warning and you couldn't do anything on it because you can't put an annotation suppress warning on an import, now you will no longer have this problem, because now the imports will not actually give you any warnings. Lint and doclint warnings will be resolved better. Import statements will be processed better, which is, if you're using Eclipse and static imports, this should be a good news for you. And Hotspot C++ unit test framework is actually well delivered and improved. Test failure troubleshooting and hotspot build system, these three are pretty much for the JDK developers. Questions? I went too fast, didn't I? Okay, reminder to myself, next time stop like in the middle and then ask questions. So in a nutshell, we have Jigsaw and modularity. We're able to create images. We're able to actually have modules which will be exporting things. So public is no longer public everywhere. Public can be actually graded. There are like 3 grades of public right now. Jar will be replaced with something better. They are deliberately withholding right now the documentation for this new format because they want to further improve it and because they don't want us to start tinkering with it just yet, because they hope to get the technical depth even more down. We now have linking, we have tools for the linking, and we have tools for finding the dependencies. JDependency allows you to find the dependencies. It's already shipped with JDK 8, so take a look at your JDK, use it for a moment. You're able to use it with Maven already. Then on the JVM side, we have tooling, we have groundwork, like for example, command line parsing, GC, string in defy. And on the APIs, we have G-Shell, we have stack walking. Process API got a significant boost. You're able to perform the operations you weren't able to perform so far. And also, Process API is something that is very simple and easy to actually do from the G-Shell side, because you're able to tap your way pretty much through all development. You're also getting the flow for the reactive streams, which is a very promising API, especially since we already know that it has the support from pretty much everybody in the industry. Now we have performance changes, we have security changes, and the question why still remains. Don't build monolith, prepare for the cloud, use the modularity to your advantage to actually reduce your images that you will be shipping to your pretty much automated deployment. So the future, JDK 1803, is well, Java, Jarek will be talking about it. He still names it Java 10. And there are a couple of projects. There is the idea, for example, to share the heaps. That is, right now we have Java heap and we have C heap. And if we have a program which uses C heap and we have a program which uses Java heap, we can't actually make those programs talk to each other and share those heaps. So IBM has developed a prototype and they're pushing for its adaptation into future releases of JDK that would make it possible. There is also another project which tries to deliver you the simple types which can be stored in memory as a sort of pretty much value container. So those value types will have no overhead, because currently if you take a look at Java objects, you'll realize that Java objects have incredible amount of information in their header. There is bias locking information, there is the age of the GC, there is the hash code, and well, that's not all. So with the object header being so large, if you're creating, for example, an array list of a large integer, all of a sudden you're wasting a huge amount of memory. So if instead of this integer, which is an object type with the identity information, we could have a simple value types, which is just a container for a simple primitive, that would be so much better if we talk about memory efficiency. So go to Jarek's talk, but you will have to choose between either this or REPL because they happen to be at the same time. Sorry about that. So what about this Java 18.03? So Mark Reinhold made an announcement, well, a week ago or so, that actually right now Java will be released much, much faster. So every quarter we will have a bug or patch release with bug fixes and patches. Every March we'll have a feature release, and every September we'll have a long-term support feature release. The difference between the long-term support and feature release and the usual feature release is the fact that LTS is actually will be kept alive for 3 years. This is already official. So this is how things will be going. The Java community was a bit surprised by the fact, and they wondered if they will be able to meet so often to discuss all the changes. And I'm also quite interested in what will be dedicated for the next changes. So Jarek's presentation may shed some answers to that. Finally, summarizing, Java went like a river. We started with smart appliances and home entertainment system, then we retargeted this to actually network. Then we actually decided that enterprise is the solution. Then we went for the standard edition for a moment, and then we went for functional programming with lambdas and streams, which were meant to actually help with big data. Now we're going for modularity. Well, I do realize that developers like us see language changes because this is what we're using, yeah? So from this point, Java 9 is not that fascinating, because frankly, you could do away without the module. You can still develop without the modules in a default module in the same way like you would develop in a default package. You still get the packages and you still have the jars. They are not gone. They are meant to be gone, but they're not gone yet. So from the development point of view, well, process API is not something that usually people use. I bet that some people will never use the REPL because main is good enough or JUnit test is good enough. They have been using it for ages. Why change now? So from the development point of view, you could say that you have number of not so interesting API or very obscure API like stack walking. What the hell is that? And I would encourage you to take a look outside of this perspective. So if you find yourself thinking along these lines, try JDK 9 in some pet project and see what it gives you. Because it would be rather sad if anything from all those changes you would just say, well, the only good thing about JDK 9 is the auth methods on the list, set, and map. So please, my personal plea for you. So Jigsaw is the team. We have improved foundations, performance, strings, compiler, control, and API in programmatic interface. We have GC changes. The GC algorithm has now several interesting things for the strings. Strings are actually being compressed, so you will not be storing the UTF character arrays. Instead, you will be storing byte arrays and a flag for the encoding, which by default, if I recall, will be the Latin one. We have better tooling and the API. These are the changes in a nutshell. Now, about Java Enterprise, well, it waited for JDK 9 and Jigsaw. So for quite a long time, there were no updates, which, for example, for people who are making a living out of application servers, like the entire department of Red Hat, which deals with JBoss and now Wildfly, or the departments from IBM, which tackles actually WebSphere. That was really problematic because these servers need to be enterprise compliant. So Enterprise 7 is pretty old, but 8 and 9 didn't move, and there was no mention of it for quite a long time. So EE Guardians, MicroProfile, these are two initiatives that actually started moving forward without Oracle. It will be interesting what happens right now, because right now Oracle donated entire enterprise code to Eclipse Foundation. So there are really good descriptions, for example, here or here, about how this problem looks from various points of view. In my opinion, EE being donated to Eclipse Foundation relieves Oracle and leaves them with their hands untied. Because right now they need to focus more on Java to make it attractive for the cloud providers and to make it much, much friendlier for the DevOps people. If this will not be done, then in the cloud, other languages, which also may run on JVM but perhaps may not, will overtake Java. So now it will move faster. We have 4 lives remaining, and we shall see what shall happen next. That is all that I have. I'm open for questions. Thank you very much for coming.